In a world where carbs are your enemy, you need one man to help you fight your battles. That man is Jimmy.
Combating nutrition disinformation and general bull. It's Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com.
Nutritional Therapy Association. The NTA trains and certifies nutritional therapy practitioners
like me
and consultants by focusing on bioindividuality.
One size diet doesn't fit all.
And the range of dietary strategies that support wellness.
Being healthy overall, y'all.
The NTA emphasizes a whole food,
vegetables from our front yard and backyard gardens,
properly prepared,
like fermented and sprouted,
and nutrient-dense diet,
like grass-fed butter and grass-fed beef,
as the key to restoring balance and enhancing the body's innate ability to heal. Throughout their programs, students learn a wide range of educational tools and techniques to identify and correct nutritional imbalances and deficiencies in their clients, and they launch a successful career in holistic nutrition.
And they might become best-selling authors and podcasters too.
The NTA produces like-minded practitioners and consultants that we consider the leaders in health and wellness.
Oh yeah.
Registration is now open for May classes, and you can learn more and save your seat by going to nutritionaltherapy.com.
Go sign up.
And don't forget to mention Jimmy and Christine Moore on your application. What's that website again, Christine?
Nutritionaltherapy.com.
Go sign up, y'all. You hear?
Oh yeah.
You're so silly. What's up, you guys? Welcome back to another Instagram Live, and we're here with another episode of Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. Here's how you can engage in the show. If you're brand new to this show and you're watching anywhere but on Instagram, you got to go follow me over on Instagram. I do live videos over there. I'm at Livin' Low Carb Man. That's spelled LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Once you're there, you can engage live just like all these beautiful people are doing right now. Thank you guys for being here today for Jimmy Rants. If you missed the live, you can watch it on replay for up to 24 hours. After 24 hours, it does disappear. Pop on over to YouTube, type in a keyword Jimmy Rants. You will find the show. Finally, the best of the best moments of this here show is in podcast form. It's the Jimmy Rants podcast over on Apple Podcasts as well as Stitcher. All of these links, you guys, are at JimmyRants.com. Today's Jimmy Rants is going to take a look at the keto community. So keto has come on strong in recent years. Lots of people now are talking about ketogenic diets. And it seems like with the popularity of keto on the rise, that there are more and more voices out there articulating concepts related to low-carb diets, to ketogenic diets, to putting your body into a state of nutritional ketosis. And what's very humorous to me as the author of the very first book that had keto in the title before my book, Keto Clarity, came out, there was no book that had keto in the title. And that was 5 years ago. But over the past couple of years, you see all these people that come out and say, oh, you're well-trusted source for all things keto. You're number one resource for keto, and I'm your guy. And I'm going, I didn't know who you were 5 years ago when I was writing Keto Clarity. So how are you an expert again? Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So what I want to talk about here today is this story that I found all about how keto is becoming, and it's going to be a little controversial today, but that's all right. That's my jam. That's what I do. Keto is becoming kind of a cult. I said it. I said it out loud. And I want to ask the question, you guys. Is enthusiastic advocacy and tribalism on behalf of this little word called keto? Is it ignoring the science? Because that is the claim that is made in this article. It's from a website called Stat News. and they got a couple of people that are pro-keto people. These aren't anti-keto people. These are people in the research realm for ketogenic diets, and they're concerned about what they have noticed happening in our culture as it relates to keto. And I've noticed certain personalities within the keto community who are saying some really stupid stuff and making claims that really don't need to be made. And I think this is a real concern, you guys, because keto as a message is incredibly sound, but there are certain things about keto that are absolutely true based on the research, but there are some things being said about keto that we don't really have all of the research to go that far in the conversation. So let me read from this, and I'll give commentary along the way. The two people that wrote it, Nicola Guess and Ethan Weiss. So these two guys wrote this article, and the title of the article is Tribalism Undermining Objectivity About Low-Carb, High-Fat Diets? And so that's what we're talking about here today, is enthusiastic advocacy for and tribalism for keto, ignoring what's actually happening in the science. And has keto become a cult? That sounds so preposterous, doesn't it? Stick around. Let's read from the article. Anyone who is active on social media has come to expect a certain degree of tribalism around various issues of the day, be it guns, climate change, abortion, politics, religion, and more. We've been surprised to see it creep into the online conversation, though, about nutritional health science, especially when it comes to low carbohydrate, high fat diets. Even more surprising to us is that such advocacy sometimes comes even from health professionals, scientists, and journalists from whom we would normally expect a certain degree of objectivity. So every movement always has lay people involved that are advocates, that get excited about it. And I'm not just talking about keto. Keto is one, but pretty much any topic that you can think of, you're going to have people that will be the cheerleaders and the advocates for it. And they won't always have background in science or background in whatever the topic is that would, I guess, give them that credence, so to speak, to be able to speak out and make claims. But they're even saying in this article that sometimes it's health professionals, people like medical doctors, sometimes it's actual scientists, and then it's even journalists that are out there that are making claims about keto in this instance. So they go on to talk about how ketogenic diets are not new. William Banting described in 1863 how a low-carb diet helped him lose weight. Since the 1970s, Atkins and South Beach have sold millions of copies. Emerging data show that low-carb, high-fat diets can lead to a reduction in weight, better control of blood sugar, insulin, triglycerides, and even blood pressure. They may increase cholesterol in the bloodstream, which they say in this article has been associated with an increased risk of heart disease. That doesn't necessarily mean low-carb, high-fat diets increase the risk of heart attack or even in those with high cholesterol, but many of the potential benefits or because of the many benefits that come from these diets. So they're laying the groundwork, you guys. And again, if you're just joining us, I'm asking this question: is the enthusiastic advocacy and tribalism for keto ignoring the science supporting keto? So we're reading from this article that I found, really interesting article. Is tribalism undermining objectivity about low-carb, high-fat diets? And one of the major concerns that are being articulated by Nicola Guess and Ethan Weiss, one of the major concerns is that there's a whole lot being said about what low-carb, high-fat diets do that doesn't match up with the science. And I'm asking a side question: is keto kind of becoming a cult? Is it getting to the point where people are just saying things without really having anything to back it up? Now, I'm a big believer in people sharing their experiences. If you go on the ketogenic diet and you see improvements happen from some disease state, bipolar, type 2 diabetes, IBS, whatever it is, then I think you should share your experience. I don't think there's anything wrong with sharing those kind of experiences. I also don't think there's anything wrong if you can cite research and studies that support what you have to say, although I would say be careful the kind of research that you cite because, and I've talked about this many times on Jimmy Rants, some of the research that gets out there, both pro and con with keto, is not really based on any solid randomized controlled trials. Most of it is kind of observational correlation type studies, and we're going to get into that here in a second in this piece, that don't really give you a whole lot when it comes to what the application would be for humans. It tells you, okay, when this happens, then that happens, and it's a correlation, but not necessarily the causation. So they've already said in this article that an increased risk of heart disease happens because it's been associated with an increased amount of cholesterol in the blood. So we're going to come back to that here in a second. All right, so they continue. It's a classic issue of balancing the benefits and the risks of something like keto. It's very complicated because if it isn't clear, then how much or in whom an increase in cholesterol would matter. That's why there is general consensus that rigorous clinical trials are needed to answer this critical question. So they're going to get into here in a minute about how some advocates are so gung-ho to say cholesterol means nothing, and they have concerns about that. So they think that we need to wait until all of this research comes out that fully vets that out before anybody says anything about cholesterol being meaningless. But what about the flip side? What about the fact that we're not seeing people who have elevated levels of cholesterol on a ketogenic diet, for example? We're not seeing people have the kind of heart attacks and heart disease progression as measured by a CT heart scan or a CIMT looking for actual signs of disease, despite eating a very high-fat diet, despite having higher cholesterol. Why do we assume that disease, because in these correlation studies they would show, would progress? So I take a little bit of issue with what's being shared here, but I do agree with the authors of this article that we have to be very careful about what we say because it can come across as tribalism. It can come across as enthusiastic advocacy with a whole lot of nuttin' supporting it. It can come across as very cultish and aggressive. You guys have seen this. You know what I'm talking about. Hopefully you don't get that from me because I try very carefully not to come across that way. I've never said keto is the be-all end-all for everyone, for every disease state. I didn't say if you break your arm and you eat keto, you're going to regenerate that bone that got broken. You're not hearing that out of Jimmy Moore's mouth. So that's why I wanted to talk about this here today. Let me continue. The role of advocates who work on behalf of a cause or a group can be essential to the success of these movements. Yeah, every popular movement has various advocates that help to progress the message along. That's the way it works. And I've been at this low-carb diet advocacy for about 15 years personally. I started in 2005 when I started blogging. And I lost the weight and changed my diet in 2004. I actually started writing about this. A lot of people don't realize this, but in the midst of my weight loss, I was writing for another website that had nothing to do with nutrition. I was writing articles for them. So as this huge change was happening in my life through weight loss and various coming off of medications, I was writing articles for that website in 2004. So I've been at this for 15 years. And I have been an advocate for low carb. You don't call yourself living La Vida low carb without being an advocate for low carb. But they continue in this story. But advocates also help to inflame the bitterness that is inherent in these battles. They're going back to that cholesterol discussion. So these authors of this article are saying, hey, look, when you've got advocates that are out there pushing a certain narrative, you're going to have battle lines drawn. I'll tell you the big one that's happened in the keto world over the past few years is the people who say that a ketogenic diet is one that should be high in fat and moderate in protein. Then you've got another side of things where people say, no, you need to prioritize protein and make that your goal, and then fat is just an afterthought. So that's the battle line that has been drawn within keto recently. But in this article, they're talking about the cholesterol question. Given the current discourse in nutrition science, it can be hard to disentangle science from advocacy. So you guys know I'm all about not just providing the science, which I think is important, but you do have to add an angle of advocacy to it. You do have to add a translatability, because all the science in the world ain't gonna reach Joe Schmo who's eating his ding dong and drinking his Coca-Cola and eating Doritos. That's the person that people like me is trying to reach. And researchers and scientists and even medical doctors, they're not going to reach those people with the sciencey message. They're simply not. And so you have to meet people where they are. And if that means you add a little bit of advocacy in there, then that's what you do. But advocacy is a double-edged sword. Advocacy lets you say things and be relatable, but in that advocacy, I think you need to have responsibility of making sure what you say does match the science. I'll tell you another one that's been put out there of where advocacy goes beyond what the science has shown. The thing that I've seen is where these people talk about keto being the answer for cancer. And that's simply not true. I don't think keto is right for all cancers. And yet you talk to some people within the keto community, oh, if everybody just ate keto, we would eradicate cancer. And that's not true. There are some cancers that can thrive on ketone bodies. So what do you do when someone goes on a ketogenic diet and they have the kind of cancer that is fed by ketones? So I've always had this, even though I'm an advocate for keto and low carb, I've always had this cautionary tale of jumping ahead of what the science shows. Let the science vet it out. There are various research groups now that are looking at this issue of cancer and ketogenic diets. Let those things vet themselves out and let's see what happens. But let's not jump the science. And that's kind of what they're getting at in this article. And again, if you're just joining us, I'm reading from this article, Is Tribalism Undermining Objectivity About Low-Carb, High-Fat Diets? Written by Nicola Guess and Ethan Weiss from statnews.com. And I'm asking the question here, is enthusiastic advocacy and tribalism for keto ignoring the science? And the underpinning question here is, has keto as a community become a cult? Because when you veer off the path of what evidence is showing, and you're merely just advocacy for advocacy's sake, and you just say whatever you want, we call you a vegan, by the way, because that's what vegans do. The whole vegan movement is all about advocacy. They have left science in the rearview mirror, and if we're not careful in the keto community, we could be following in the same footsteps as the plant-based world. And I don't think we need to. We have enough evidence that shows what we do know. Let's stick to what we do know and not go too far off the beaten path. I'm going to continue reading from the article. The idea that a dietary intervention might affect heart attack risk isn't complicated or controversial. According to the cholesterol hypothesis, too much LDL, bad cholesterol, in the blood leads to its deposition in artery walls, The resulting plaque can block arteries and lead to heart attack or stroke. This theory has been bolstered by decades of evidence ranging from epidemiological associations to genetic studies and interventional drug trials. There may be no better studied pathway in modern medicine. All right, I'm going to take a little bit of a different viewpoint than the authors of this article. So they even note that it's been studied epidemiologically. They've noted that there are genetic predispositions for high cholesterol, and then they've noted the drug trials. In any of that, did you see randomized controlled trial? No. There have not been to date randomized controlled clinical trials that show that a calculated number on your cholesterol panel means anything. So an LDL number on a standard lipid panel, LDL-C is how it's written, doesn't really show you anything when it comes to its impact on your heart health. It doesn't. The biggest factor that we have seen in research studies, which they did not note in this article, the biggest correlation to a heart attack and heart disease is not LDL cholesterol. It's not even HDL cholesterol. It's triglycerides. And as triglycerides go, so goes your risk for heart disease, your risk for a heart attack, your risk for metabolic disturbances of pretty much any kind. Trigs is where it's at. They didn't acknowledge that anywhere, and we've seen that a lot in the real research from people like Dr. Jeff Follick, who has been out there for many years making the correlation between the triglyceride to HDL ratio, small dense LDL particles, not just LDL. So I take a little bit of umbrage and see maybe this is what their concern is. I'm a non-medically trained professional. I don't have any MD, RD, PhD, or anything after my name that shows that I'm supposed to know anything about this. And yet I wrote a whole book called Cholesterol Clarity all about this. So I educated myself as a layperson to understand how all this works. I actually had a medical doctor as my co-author, Dr. Eric Westman, one of the most respected researchers in the ketogenic space. And I tried very hard in that book to stick to what the data said. And Dr. Westman helped me with that. I would write things and he'd go behind me and make sure that they were on point with what the studies actually show. And in there, we determined, based on the evidence that's out there, that there is no correlation with LDL cholesterol to heart disease. In fact, we found a study that showed most of the patients who were admitted to a hospital, 75% of them that were admitted to a hospital because of chest pain, because of a heart attack, or some other related cardiovascular event, most of those people, 3 out of 4 of them, had LDL cholesterol in the very normal range. That was just one study that we found. There were many studies that showed there was a better correlation when it came to triglycerides. And when you had elevated levels of triglycerides, you also had higher blood sugar, higher A1C, higher fasting insulin levels. All of those things played a huge role. But they think in this article that because people like me and others who say, well, total cholesterol is pretty much meaningless, LDL cholesterol is really not the be-all, end-all because it's a calculated number, I'm suddenly being an advocate that's being enthusiastic that they claim goes beyond the science, and it's simply not true. I'm stating the science. I'm articulating it in such a way that shows an alternative viewpoint to the popular belief, and that popular belief is high cholesterol is going to give you a heart disease. High LDL is a risk factor, a strongly correlated risk factor for having a heart attack. And the problem is we don't have it fully vetted out because they have not actually done a randomized controlled clinical trial. See how it works here? They want to taint people who are advocates for low-carb, high-fat diets by saying, look, they jumped the gun on what the research is actually showing. And they're citing the lipid stuff, the cholesterol stuff. But I've already given an example of how I think it does happen with cancer, when we say it's the answer for all cancers. And I think there's other areas where we do jump the gun on it. But on the cholesterol, most of us that are advocating for cholesterol not being the be-all, end-all in your heart health, I think we're articulating the science, and they need to know that. We actually believe in low-carb, high-fat nutrition. These are the two authors of this article. One of us advises a company that uses this approach to treat individuals with type 2 diabetes. Also recently co-founded a company using this approach for the purposes of weight loss. The other one uses low-carb, high-fat nutrition with her patients, is the principal investigator of many studies of low-carb, high-fat nutrition in both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Well, here's the thing. If both of these are respected people that are believers in low-carb, high-fat diets, then they know that LDL-C on a standard lipid panel is a calculated number. Not a directly measured number, a calculated number. And both of them work in the field of type 2 diabetes. If they know that type 2 diabetes is a metabolic disease, then they know the disease that type 2 diabetes comes from is insulin resistance. And if they know about insulin resistance, then they know that the correlation of insulin resistance with cardiovascular issues is extraordinarily strong. And yet they want to chastise the advocates for ketogenic diets for being too far ahead of the science. And I think they're missing the boat here. We see this approach to nutrition as an exciting tool in the management of weight and cardiometabolic disease. Here's the thing. You see it as an exciting tool in weight loss and in helping people with type 2 diabetes and heart disease. And yet you don't want people advocating for it. That's talking out of both sides of your mouth. Because without advocates, let's play this game. Let's pretend like I never existed. And Live in La Vida Low Carb as a blog and as a podcast, and all the people that I interviewed in the early days of my work never happened. Would the message have progressed along as quickly as it did? Would we know as much as we do now? I think that you need advocates to help progress along a message. And I think I appreciate the message they're trying to share here of saying that you don't want advocates to be speaking for a movement over the scientists, especially when it comes to nutritional health. But I think they're missing the point. Advocacy makes it so that the general public is paying attention. Advocacy progresses along. You could have all the best research in the world, and I'll tell you an example of this. When I first started interviewing on the Live in La Vida Low Carb show, a lot of these researchers, Jeff Folek and Steve Finney and Eric Westman and all these people, a lot of them didn't have any platform for getting their message out. They didn't have books, they didn't have blogs, they didn't have, social media wasn't around when I first started doing this. They didn't have a way to get the message out, but they came on my show and we gave them a platform, and people heard about them. People heard their work, and then they went and learned. And people have written me over the years saying, I learned about X person because I first heard them on your show. And I'm just an advocate. I don't have any letters after my name, by design, by the way. I don't want the letters. I like being that educated layperson. And yet, if you talk to these people in this article, they will tell you that people like me, maybe they're not pointing the finger at me, but people like me that are advocates for low-carb ketogenic diets, people like me, they say, are the problem. No, I think people like me are a part of the reason why keto is a thing in 2019. If there was no keto clarity, would keto be a thing in 2019? I don't know. It's really fascinating. We are disturbed by the discourse surrounding the ketogenic diet, which often feels less like science and more like cheerleading. I think you need both. You need both science that supports what you have to say, and then you need people who will be cheerleaders for that science. When I wrote Keto Clarity, most of the stuff that I put in there was not revolutionary, brand new information. What made it fresh and interesting was it was the first time somebody had taken the complexity of nutritional ketosis and explained it in everyday language so that anybody could understand it. That was the beauty of that book, and it's why that book still resonates with people today. So would these authors think that Keto Clarity is simply advocacy that feels less like science and more like cheerleading? I guarantee you, we put 186 references in the back of Keto Clarity so that you knew it was referenced solidly on nutritional health science. And yet, if you read it, it read easy. And by design, I wanted it to be easy to understand. The evidence, to be sure, nutritional tribalism is not limited to discussions about the relative merits or demerits of low-carb, high-fat diets. The evidence that nutrition has become a team sport is found in Twitter. I stay away from Twitter now. Twitter has become such a morass of ugliness that I can't handle that anymore. Instagram's pretty good. Facebook has also jumped the shark. There's just so much ugliness on there. It's why I like hanging out with you guys here on Instagram. Found in the Twitter handles of individuals rooting for their favorite nutritional movement, small plant emojis in the Twitter handles of vegan advocates, or a stake in those promoting carnivore types of diets. To bolster their cause for low-carb, high-fat diets, these advocates, including some scientists and doctors, claim that the cholesterol hypothesis is a conspiracy led by pharmaceutical companies in an effort to sell more drugs. Well, I don't think it's necessarily a conspiracy per se, but you can't deny that there are companies involved in the pharmaceutical world that made a drug who did one thing on your cholesterol panel. It lowered LDL, and by extension of that, total cholesterol. That's what they did. That's all they did. And so because they created a drug that would manipulate this one marker on a cholesterol panel, they were able to make billions upon billions, tens of billions of dollars every single year just on cholesterol lowering medications. And those drugs have incredible side effects that nobody talks about. The muscle aches and pains messes with your brain health. It increases your risk of diabetes. It increases your risk of cancer. And it even increases the risk of the very thing it's supposed to help with, heart disease. And yet we never hear about those things. And so if a doctor comes out and says the cholesterol hypothesis is a conspiracy led by pharmaceutical companies in an effort to sell more drugs, I'm feeling what that's talking about, because they're putting the emphasis on, again, a calculated number, not something that actually matters in your health. What matters is triglycerides, HDL, small dense LDL particles, insulin, blood sugar, A1C. I can go down the list. And so, yes, I see where people could jump the gun and say, this is all a conspiracy theory. They just want to sell you a drug. There are some people who could benefit from statin medications, but it's generally people that have already had some kind of a cardiovascular event. And even in that case, it's because of the anti-inflammatory effects of those drugs, not that the drug has anything special in and of itself. Others have suggested that cholesterol may actually protect against cardiovascular disease. Well, again, that's a nuanced discussion. Cholesterol in and of itself, no. But certain kinds of cholesterol, is there a problem with having higher levels of HDL cholesterol, which is pretty indicative of what happens when you go keto? No, HDL cholesterol is the one that you want to have higher. And I would even say having higher amounts of LDL, that is the large fluffy kind, is probably also protective. But they're going to come back at Jimmy Moore and say, see, you're one of those advocates that is spreading misinformation because we don't know enough about it. Not knowing enough about it means you should be demanding for more research if you have concerns about it. I don't think that because we don't have the fully vetted out randomized controlled clinical trial type of research that you need to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, we need to continue the status quo until we figure it out. I think if there was a true danger in having higher amounts of LDL cholesterol, if there was true danger happening, we would be seeing keto people keeling over from a heart attack every single day. But it ain't happening. And it has to make you wonder, why isn't it happening? If all these advocates that are talking about a conspiracy theory with pharmaceutical companies, or that having higher amounts of cholesterol, certain kinds of cholesterol, is protective against a cardiovascular disease, I think you should ask the question, why have we not seen more bodies in the street, so to speak? This has some good points in here, but I think they're missing the point. The advocacy is based on the science that we know. And if they don't like the science that's out there, then I think they should be advocates for making more science that would support this. Let me continue. This effort to discredit the role of cholesterol in cardiovascular disease is striking because the evidence linking elevated cholesterol to heart disease and heart attack risk is so strong. No, it's not. This is the problem. There is not solid evidence that connects the role of high cholesterol with cardiovascular disease. And again, they're going to look at Jimmy Moore and say, see, you're one of those advocates that has no letters after your name and has no business saying this kind of thing to the general public. Show me, though, I would flip the script on them. Show me the randomized, controlled clinical trial that shows having an elevated level of cholesterol, total and LDL cholesterol, has any meaning when it comes to your cardiovascular risk. It doesn't. And I would say that the evidence that we do have is, again, triglycerides. That's the connection that's not being made in these cholesterol studies. This makes us wonder why advocates might be taking this approach. It's possible that acknowledging an unknown risk might undermine or discredit the benefits of low-carb, high-fat nutrition. No, I'm not worried about you discrediting low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic diets. If you show me a randomized controlled clinical trial that shows that a low-carb, high-fat diet does actually increase mortality rates, does increase your risk of heart disease and having a heart attack, I'm all ears. Let me see the evidence. The problem is that evidence doesn't exist, and you cannot quote from epidemiological research. You can't quote from research that's being conducted by pharmaceutical companies. You just can't. You can't quote from research that looks at people who have a genetic predisposition for high cholesterol, this familial hypocholesterolemia. You can't say, well, it happens in them, therefore anybody with elevated cholesterol, this is what's going to happen. I want to see good science. And these authors who are poo-pooing those of us that are advocates of cholesterol not meaning anything, we're advocates for that because we hadn't seen the evidence yet. Show us the real evidence, and there is not strong evidence to date. That kind of thinking ignores a central tenet of medicine. Everything that we do in medicine, from appendectomies to cancer chemotherapy to diet therapy, has benefit and risk. If a chemotherapy had a 10% chance of a side effect, that doesn't make it any less likely to cure your cancer. So why wouldn't we treat the science of nutrition any differently? Perhaps because science has morphed into advocacy. Successful advocacy demands a clear narrative, yet science and biology is inherently gray. The reason why advocacy exists is if you leave that inherently gray out there to dangle, how do people know what to do? This is part of the challenge that science needs to get with the program and get on the bandwagon of. Science wants to keep it purposely gray, purposely in the middle area. And I agree that is the role that science plays. You need to keep it because you're always going to have those questions. And that's what good science is, by the way. You're always going to question what you think you know. Even something that you think you know that you know that you know, until you get that solid evidence that proves what you're saying is true, you need to have that healthy bit of skepticism, which will have that inherently gray area pretty much always. What advocacy does is it takes what we do know from the research that has been done, and it puts a finer point on it, and in that finer point makes it palatable to the general public. If the general public doesn't understand what the science is saying because it's purposefully inherently gray, they don't know what to do. So you gotta put a finer point on it. Now, when you do that, do you jump the science somewhat? Probably in some instances, but if you don't get people to see anything from the science, if they can't translate it into their everyday life through advocacy, then they'll never make a change. People will keep eating a standard American diet. For example, in the nutritional science world, people will just keep eating junk food. Well, you guys hadn't figured it out yet, so we're just going to keep eating this crap till you do. And what happens? Those people die. Those people get sick. Those people stay on a bad path. The reason why people come to keto is they're tired of not having a finer point put on what they should be doing. And somebody comes along and writes a book like Keto Clarity that helps to put a finer point on some of these ideas, and then they understand it, and then they want to learn more. Then they do get into the nutritional health science and dig a little deeper and look a little harder at this. But if you don't get them in it to begin with, they can never make a change. There are other choices, such as seeking testing to better define cardiovascular risk or taking a statin or other medication if needed. I'm a huge advocate for people getting tests run to look at their cardiovascular risk. You hear me talk about quite often getting a CT heart scan to get a heart calcium score. Huge to know what your actual risk of disease is. Very scientific. I'm also an advocate of getting a CIMT, which is the carotid intima scan. It's a little ultrasound of your carotid arteries to see if there's any intima thickness there. I'm also a fan of getting advanced cholesterol panels like an NMR lipoprofile, which would look at the actual LDL particles and particle size. All of those things are very, very scientific. And I encourage people to get those pretty much regularly if you want to prevent heart disease and see where you stand in your heart health. And yet, I'm an advocate, and they want to poo-poo on that. I think that's silly. It's also possible to change the type of high-fat foods in the diet, emphasizing those with unsaturated fats like olive oil, salmon, avocado, or nuts, while eating fewer foods with saturated fats like butter, cream, and bacon. These approaches aren't anti-low-carb, high-fat nutrition. Sorry, I don't buy the premise that you need to switch out all of your saturated fats for monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. No, you don't. No, you don't. Now, I do think we need to be careful as advocates in the keto community of not saying that everything, you cook everything in a stick of butter. You don't. You mix the fats. You need a healthy mix of all the fats, which includes saturated fat, which should probably be about 30% of your calories from fat should come from saturated fat. Also, monounsaturated fat, which should be about 60% of the amount of fat that you're consuming on a ketogenic diet, and about 10% from the polyunsaturated fat, mostly from nuts and seeds and things like that. And the problem is most people don't know that, like a steak, for example, doesn't just have saturated fat, even though everybody points to steak and hamburger. Oh, that's saturated fat. Most of what is in beef is actually monounsaturated fat. So that's the challenge that comes into play here. So let's not pretend like that people aren't eating more unsaturated fat sources. They are. They are. Nutrition science may be essentially ripe for advocacy because of the linked epidemics of obesity and type 2 diabetes that so clearly stem from our changing lifestyle. And everyone has a stake in nutrition, but that is all the more reason we should be clear-eyed about what we know, even if what we know is we don't know. We all have to eat and make our choices based on imperfect evidence. Of course, if a high-quality, large-scale, randomized controlled trial showed conclusively that the risks for low-carb, high-fat approach outweighed the benefit, as health professionals and scientists, we would accept that. No, they wouldn't. No, they wouldn't. I've been at this for a little while, and all the best evidence that has been put out there to date has not been accepted by the general medicinal health community. They don't want to hear anything about this. And the other thing they're not talking about in this, when it comes to nutritional health science, is that the mainstream medical community has no business talking about nutrition. Not one single time in this article did they even mention that doctors don't get the training that they need to talk about nutrition. So you want to talk about advocacy and tribalism on something you don't know anything about and jumping to science. It's medical doctors that are doing that worse than any other profession in the world. Unless they've gone and learned on their own and taken a look at some of the nutritional health journals out there, they don't know what the actual evidence is and support for the nutrition that they promote to their patients, namely a low-fat diet, healthy whole grains, and that kind of thing. They don't. In the other direction, if low-carb, high-fat diets were shown to protect against cardiovascular disease, regardless of its effect on LDL, then that should be accepted and integrated into clinical practice. Again, it won't. It won't until they start teaching it in medical school. We believe that the intrusion of advocacy into science has led to reductionism and the creation of false dichotomies. Is that the fault of advocates? I think the fact that advocates have risen up to be able to create a narrative around nutritional health science, I think the fact that it had to take someone like a layperson like Jimmy Moore to get out here and start talking about nutrition that runs counter to what's out there in the mainstream, I think that is a perfect example of the failure of the science community. If the science community wanted to be viable, here's how they should have set it up, and they still have time to do this. If a study comes out, then you have people that translate what that study means. You don't leave it to journalists. You don't leave it to people outside of the people that actually did the research. You publish the research, you put it out there, but then you have people that were a part of that research or some independent counsel that does this with any study, and you have them translate it into lay people language. What's happening now is you've got journalists who are looking for clickbait headlines, and some scientific evidence comes out, and then those journalists, they pull some little something from the study and they make that the headline. We see it all the time. And then whenever I've called out researchers where there's some story written about their research, they're like, oh, we never said that. That's what the journalist did. So that's why advocacy has risen up. That's why you've got people like me that advocate for what's happening in the research world and translating science. That's why advocacy exists. If these scientific journals and some of these people doing the research had a way to translate what they actually said in their study into everyday language and didn't leave it just to the scientific journalists and health journalists out there, then maybe people like me wouldn't exist. Don't blame advocacy for the failure of the scientific community to get their message out in a palatable way to the general public. You shouldn't. We believe that scientists, healthcare professionals, and journalists must avoid intentionally confusing or alarming the public in an attempt to discredit legitimate science, ultimately in the name of advocating for an agenda. Look, my agenda with what I do, you guys, is to see people get healthy. My agenda is to correct misinformation that is being put out there, and on a daily basis, people going to see their doctor and their doctor telling them a bunch of crap. And while I have mad respect for the medical profession and what they do well, like fixing a broken arm, I don't have any respect for them and what they're telling their patients when it comes to nutrition and how to fix various parts of their health through nutrition. They're not trained, and that's the problem. And so if you're calling for scientists, healthcare professionals, and journalists to avoid intentionally confusing and alarming the public in an attempt to discredit legitimate science, then you need to do a better job of explaining what the legitimate science actually is saying. If you can't do that, that's your problem. You need to figure out a way. You need to figure out a way to find people like me that could take what you are saying, listen to what you have to say, translate it into everyday language, and then make it palatable to people. That's how people can take the information you're doing in the research and doing something with it. Otherwise, what's the point of the research? If you can't translate it and make it palatable for people, what is the point? In addition to being dangerous, such ostensible advocacy appears to be an intentional attempt to degrade the public's trust in science. No. The scientific community has done a great job, especially in the nutritional health space. They've done a great job of discrediting themselves. Why? Because they have been the ones who have been pushing really bad science. And with all due respect to the authors of this article, epidemiological research is the bane of your existence in the scientific world. Epidemiological research is not valid research. And if by me saying that as an advocate makes me look silly, in your opinion, dangerous, then so be it. But it's true. Epidemiological research doesn't really show you much. I want to see randomized controlled clinical trials. I want to see good studies, even if they're small studies. I want to see good studies on humans being done, and that being promoted as good science. Not observational studies, not epidemiological studies, not studies on mice, not studies on other animals. None of that is relevant to human nutrition. And yet what you talked about mostly in this article was all this nonsense, bad science, and that we should be respecting that science. That science doesn't deserve to be respected. I want to see good research. And if it takes a layperson like me to be an advocate and to articulate that we need better science, so be it. That's what it takes. One needs look no further than the tragedy of the false story linking vaccines to autism as an example of what can and will result. Well, I don't think people that advocate for keto have any relationship to the people that are advocating for vaccinations or not vaccinations. That's silly. Don't try to convolute this issue. And again, with all due respect to Nicola Guess and Ethan Weiss, Nicola is a PhD and registered dietitian at the University of Westminster in London. Ethan Weiss is a preventative cardiologist and associate professor of medicine at UC San Francisco. With all due respect to these guys, I disagree. I think we need advocates. I think if the scientific community has failed to get their message out in an effective way, then it takes advocates to pick up the baton. if advocates do a better job of it, that is not the fault of the advocates. That's the fault of the failure of the scientific community. And I will continue to be a low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic diet advocate because I can take a look at the science, I can cut through the muckety-muck, make it translatable to the general public. And I'm just but one person. There's lots of people that are doing this. I will caution and I will agree with them that we should be careful to only look at what the science is actually stating and not overstate it and step over that. But let's not pretend like simply because you advocate and you don't have the letters after your name, or even if you do have the letters after your name, that doesn't mean that what you have to say is invalid. So the bottom line in this Jimmy Rants is enthusiastic advocacy and tribalism for keto ignoring the science? No, we're not ignoring the science. What we're doing is amplifying it and showing you guys that listen to us the relevancy of what the studies have to say. All right, let's see what you guys have to say. Welcome in, welcome in. Thank you for being here on today's episode of Jimmy Rants. The cancer connection is so personal for me, says Val. I was injected with glucose before a scan 12 years ago. Since the cancer would light up, so does keto prevent it? I'll let you know after my mammogram today. Well, Val, good luck to you. Beth says, I think it's important to not be an unkind turd ball zealot. Yes, that's the concern, Beth. I've been out here a long time, and you guys know I try to be a gentleman to everybody, even the people that are really ugly to me. I always try to be very kind back to them. But I've seen some of the public discourse online, and it ain't pretty. And this is people in the keto world. And I think it's turned off a lot of people to the message, which is a very powerful message. But if people are turd balls in the process of it all, that message gets lost. It could be the best message in the world, but if the messenger is an idiot, you're not going to embrace it. We like hanging out on Instagram with you. Thank you, Night Owl. I like being here. Keto Bob says, I'll say it is a conspiracy. And I get that. It does seem that way, that all of these pharmaceutical companies, and they're in cahoots very heavily with the mainstream medicine community. So as an advocate saying that it seems like this connection between the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry and promoting a drug that artificially lowers LDL cholesterol, does that make us as advocates dangerous? According to these two people in this article, yes. But I think it's something that we have to pay attention to. And guys, they made $29 billion with a B dollars a year just on statin drugs to lower your cholesterol. Now, they're generics now, so they make a lot less money now. But back in the heyday of Lipitor and Crestor, they were making a killing off of this mirage that lowering your LDL cholesterol actually improved your heart disease risk. And we don't have any hard evidence of that. We have correlation studies. We have studies paid for by the pharmaceutical companies. Here's the other thing they did not mention in here. What about all the pharmaceutical companies who started studies on their statin medications looking at the LDL effect, and they actually had people dying being on their drugs, dying of a heart attack? They squelched that research. That is a fact. That is an absolute fact, but they weren't forced to publish their studies. So why didn't you mention that, Nicola Guess and Ethan Weiss? Why don't you mention all the squelching of the real science that was out there that would have showed the exact opposite? So there is not strong evidence. I stay away from most groups of any kind because they can get too legalistic, says Val. It's difficult to stay objective in that sense. Gene says, keto reversed my high blood pressure naturally. Together with the weight loss is why I became a keto advocate and chose keto for life. And you've seen it in your own life. And I think any of us that have seen a life change as a result of making a change in our diet, we should be advocates. There's no law against being an advocate. And if an advocate has a greater voice than the scientific community, why is that the fault of an advocate? Why, if you choose to follow Jimmy Moore and listen to the things that I have to share, why am I considered dangerous, according to these people? And the information that I share is just automatically dismissed. Why would you believe that? It's not necessarily true. And why can't you get your shiz together and figure out how to communicate it in a better way? Ashton says there's a difference between being a knowledgeable advocate over an enthusiastic zealot. That's true. You can have great knowledge, not necessarily have the background that would show that you have the ability to be able to articulate these things, but you could still articulate it pretty well. Statins and diabetes, no mention either. Exactly. Patricia says lay people have a general distrust of science right now in the keto world because of twisted misrepresentation of the Key study. We thought scientists wouldn't lie. That's true, Patricia. Ansel Keys is a prime example of why there's a lot of skepticism about the science. He fudged the data, and nobody will dismiss. And they didn't mention Ansel Keys in here anywhere. Got a lot of issues with what they shared in here. I agree with the sentiment of what they shared, but the way they outlined it, they made it look like all of us that are advocates are just a bunch of wackadoodles. And we're not. We're the ones probably going to progress the science a lot more than any other group out there. That's all the time we have for this episode of Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. As always, you can engage live in the content here on Jimmy Rants, but you got to go follow me over on Instagram Live. I'm at Living Low Carb Man, LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Once you're there, you can engage live just like all these awesome people did here today. Thank you guys for being here. If you missed the live, you can watch it on replay for up to 24 hours. After 24 hours, you do need to pop over to YouTube, type in a keyword Jimmy Rant. You will find the show. Finally, the best of the best moments of this here show is in podcast form. It's the Jimmy Rants podcast over on Apple Podcasts as well as Stitcher. All of these links, you guys, are at jimmyrants.com. So until next time, we'll see you then.